Welcome to this, which is the third of our annual lectures, always given by a graduate, in honor of Siegbert Prawer, a distinguished former colleague and a great performer himself. Welcome to Siegbert's son, Johnny, who is once again with us. And welcome most especially to Rachel Wong, who won the Goethe Society's international competition to be this year's Prawer lecturer. Rachel did a master's in Greek and Latin literatures at Magdalen College, Oxford for 1 year in 2019, 2020. And she tells us that she is, I quote, currently a doctoral candidate jointly affiliated with the Committee on Social Thought and Germanic Studies at Chicago, working on a dissertation entitled After Schiller, Naive Modernism from Nietzsche to the New Left. The project tries to show the overlooked influence of Schiller's Über naive und sentimentalische Dichtung on later works of philosophy and literature, including Nietzsche, Adorno, and Thomas Mann. Leaving aside for a moment Rachel's very specific subject, a close reading of a single Schiller poem of which our membership secretary has circulated at Précy, I'd like to say a bit about her thesis subject, partly for its central literary historical significance and partly, if you'll allow me, a little reminiscence for the way it echoes my own scholarly beginnings. In 1957, when I came up to Oxford, Schiller's Naive und sentimentalische Dichtung was a prescribed text for the German preliminary course. That was indeed to throw us in at the deep end. But if you survived, it had a profound influence and could permanently shape your thinking about literary and cultural history. It also shaped Thomas Mann's thinking, so he is rightly present as the final name in Rachel's list. More than once, Mann refers to, I quote, Schillers unsterbliche Abhandlung, diesen klassischen Essay der Deutschen, der eigentlich alle übrigen überflüssig macht, da sie in sich enthält. That is a fine and just appreciation of Schiller's great essay, but it's also an excuse by Thomas Mann for not having himself achieved a grand survey of his own contemporary culture. And that is something he tried to do around 1910 in a grand project, Geist und Kunst, for which extensive drafts still survive. So that too was überflüssig, as it turned out, but he does imagine how it might have been by handing it over to Gustav von Aschenbach in Der Tod in Venedig, along with all the other works that he, Mann, planned but never wrote in those doldrum years after Buddenbrooks. Mann dreams of the status each one of them would have achieved, describing them all as if giving them a review. In this case, he describes his own never-written essay as die leidenschaftliche Abhandlung über Geist und Kunst, deren ordnende Kraft und antithetische Beredsamkeit ernste Beurteiler vermochte, sie unmittelbar neben Schillers Raisonnement über naive und sentimentalische Dichtung zu stellen. Was the review of what he never wrote and what Aschenbach wrote triumphantly. I had these connections in mind when I chose Thomas Mann and Schiller as my DPhil topic. Rachel doesn't have to rush to add that to her bibliography, as I, in my turn, never wrote the thesis. I was interrupted by getting a job instead and spent a decade broadening the conception into a book called Thomas Mann, The Uses of Tradition. Please forgive that I got carried away in a self-indulgent manner by the conception of Rachel writing, as it were, my thesis for me, certainly as confirmation that Rachel too is onto something in the deep structures of literary reality. And now we can look into another depth, oceanic depth, in Rachel's reading of Schiller's poem Der Ring des Polykrates. Rachel.
Thank you, Professor Reed. My sincere thanks also go to Charlotte Lee, Astrid Kula, and Charlie Louth for their invitation, and to Dan Wilson for his logistical handling of this trip. Research for this project was supported by the Fulbright Commission and the Germanistic Society of America. So I'm just going to share screen now. Charlotte, can I maybe just get a thumbs up that it's correct? Perfect. As Lucretius once observed, the laws of time and space seem to work differently when we are at sea. Quote, a ship in which we sail moves on while it seems to stand still. The hills and plains which we row or sail by seem to be flying astern, end quote. Nautical landscapes follow rules of their own, confounding our senses so persistently that we might well call the ocean the supreme realm of optical illusions. For someone who had never himself seen the sea, Schiller's poetic corpus contains a marvelous repertoire of watery images. From the auditory fidelity of the famous line from his 1797 ballad, Der Taucher, Es wallet und siedet und brauset und zischt, to the sublime representations of stormy waves, piracy, shipwreck, abysses, and deep-sea monsters that populate many of his ballads. The ocean is one of Schiller's favorite topoi for expressing what Gerhard Neumann, following Giorgio Agamben, has referred to as the Grenzsituationen of human existence, balanced as it perpetually is between freedom and fate. Das Meer ist der Ausnahmezustand der entfesselten Natur, Neumann writes. In einer ganzen Reihe der Schillerschen Balladen spielt das Meer, der reißende Strom, das tobende Gewässer mit Wirbeln und Strudeln eine entscheidende Rolle. Und es ist genau die Grenze zwischen Land und Meer, an der sich das Handeln aus dem Ausnahmezustand einstellt. Prominent among these ballads are Die Chronische des Ibicus, in which a singer is guided by birds across an ocean, and Hero und Leander, in which a stormy sea separates two lovers and eventually drowns them both. In these alternately tragic and fable-like narratives, the ocean figures as a force of the dynamic sublime that has the power to upend even the best laid of human plans. The poem on which I will be focusing today, Der Ring des Polykrates, composed during the Balladenjahr of 1797, is one that has been relatively overlooked in the secondary literature on ballads and the sea. The poem reworks a passage from Herodotus Histories and tells the story of the Greek king Polykrates, whose unending streak of good fortune causes his ally, Amasis II of Egypt, to worry that his friend will come to a bad end. On Amasis' advice, Polykrates attempts to forestall divine envy by throwing his most prized possession, a signet ring, into the sea. But when the royal chef discovers the ring in the belly of a fish and returns it to the king, Amasis thinks that Polykrates' fate is sealed and dissolves their alliance, mourning in advance his friend's demise. In my talk today, I would like to explore the role of ocean imagery in Schiller's poetic transformation of Herodotus' historical prose. How did these texts mediate what Schiller saw in Herodotus' tale? And what symbolic resonances did Polykrates' story have for his 18th century German interpreters? We will first consider how Schiller adapts the themes of fortune and finitude from Herodotus' histories. In the second portion of my talk, Tragic Flotsam, The Return of Polydorus, I will suggest that another classical source lies in the background of Schiller's ballad, one that has not been discussed in the scholarship to date, Euripidean tragedy. By uncovering an allusion to Euripides' Hecuba in Schiller's poem, I will argue that Schiller imbues his Herodotean source material with a miniaturized tragic pattern of recognition and reversal. In the third section, The Avoidance of Depth, we will then consider the extent to which the ballad's characters react to the ocean's offerings in tragic attitudes of terror, horror, and naive jubilation. In the fourth part, we will take a look at what this all means in the context of the ballad's eclecticism as a form. In the final portion, I will consider a comic reworking of Schiller's poem in Heinrich Teveles' 1888 play Der Ring des Polykrates, which was later used as a libretto for an opera buffa by a 17-year-old Erich Wolfgang Korngold. In this version, Amasis and Polykrates are reimagined as jealous friends. The ocean's fateful distortions of time are refigured in a thoroughly terrestrial setting, thereby signaling the ballad form's final resting place in the arms of parody. But first, Herodotus. Given his own limited facility with Greek, Schiller drew his source material from Johann Friedrich Degen's multi-volume translation Herodots Geschichte, published between 1783 and 1788, as well as Christian Garve's philosophical commentary from 1796, Über zwei Stellen des Herodots. In Degen's translation, the story goes as follows. After Polykrates and his two brothers revolt and seize power over the Greek island of Samos, Polykrates kills his elder brother, exiles the younger one, and sets himself up as sole ruler of the island. Under his leadership, Samos quickly becomes a formidable naval power and forms an alliance with Amasis II of Egypt. he also starts indiscriminately raiding and pillaging his neighbors, even those with whom he's on friendly terms. As Degen translates it, ohne Anzahl der Person plünderte und verheerte überall und sagte, damit erzeige einem Freunde einem größeren Gefallen, wenn ihm das Abgenommene zurückgebe, als wenn gar nichts von ihm erbeutet hätte. This obviously makes his ally Amasis quite concerned. And so he writes to Polykrates a letter to warn him that the gods do not look kindly on those who are too fortunate, and to advise him to break his lucky streak by throwing away whatever it is that he holds most dear, was dir vorzüglich lieb sein. Polykrates takes time to reflect on whether or not Amasis has his best interests at heart, and when he decides that he does, he chooses as his sacrifice an emerald signet ring, a beautiful work of craftsmanship by the renowned jeweler Theodorus of Samos. Polykrates sails out in a 50-oared ship, and in plain sight of the entire crew, he casts away his ring, sails back home, and takes time to grieve his loss. But several days later, and this is a painting from 1664 by Salvator Rosa of the scene, the ring returns in the belly of a fish. When Amasis hears about the miraculous event, he sees that Polykrates' fate is sealed, that no man can ever stop another from going to his doom. In Degen's translation, schickte ihm daher einen Herold nach Samos und ließ ihm das Freundschaftsbündnis aufkündigen, damit, wenn dem Polykrates ein großes Unglück begegnen sollte, sich über ihn als seinen Bundesfreund nicht betrüben dürfte. Herodotus later goes on to report that Polykrates does in fact come to a bad end when he is assassinated by a vindictive Persian satrap. This is him on the cross, also by Salvator Rosa. As Degen translates it, so endigte sich des Polykrates glänzendes Schicksal, wie ihm Amasis der König in Ägypten vorher gesagt hatte. As we will see in a moment, Schiller reproduces Herodotus' tale with several crucial emendations. Of the 15 stanzas of the poem, only the last 7 are about the ring and the fish. Amasis is no longer a correspondent from afar, but rather in a nod to Solon's visit to Croesus in Herodotus Book 1, he is now physically present on the island. Stand auf seines Daches Zinnen. Schaute mit vergnügten Sinnen auf das beherrschte Samos hin. Dies alles ist mir untertänig, beginnt zu Ägyptens König. Gestehe, dass ich glücklich bin. The leisurely tempo of Herodotus' account, in which letters are sent back and forth between the two kings, is replaced here by an almost magical rhythm, in which Amasis' repeated warnings are spoken like inverse spells that immediately take effect in the world. For every time that Amasis acknowledges that Polykrates is fortunate and then worries about the future, something promptly happens to prove him wrong. This repeats itself 4 times. In the first cycle, Amasis begins, Du hast der Götter Gunst erfahren, die vormals deinesgleichen waren, sie zwingt jetzt deines Zepters Macht. Doch einer lebt noch, sich zu rächen. Dich kann mein Mund nicht glücklich sprechen, solang des Feindes Auge wacht. Und der König noch geendet, da stellt sich von Milet gesendet ein Bote dem Tyrannen dar. Lass Herr des Opfers Düfte steigen und mit des Lorbeers muntern Zweigen bekränze dir dein festlich Haar. Getroffen sank dein Feind vom Speere, mich sendet mit der frohen Meere dein treuer Feldherr Polydor und nimmt aus einem schwarzen Becken noch blutig zu der beiden Schrecken ein wohlbekanntes Haupt hervor. So that's the first group of stanzas. Amasis gives his warning about the remaining enemy. Then the enemy's severed head is delivered by a messenger of the field captain, Polydorus. We don't actually know whose head Schiller was referring to here. Scholars have suggested that it might have been Polykrates' brother who had just been exiled from the island. And we also don't know who the treuer Feldherr Polydor was, since there is no such character in Herodotus. But I'll say more about this later. In the second group of stanzas, and I won't be reading these ones aloud, Amasis is horrified at the sight of the severed head. Then he worries that the Samian ships might be destroyed at sea. But his concerns are contradicted by the fleet's immediate and safe return. Then, in the third group of stanzas, Amasis reacts in shock at the returning ships, but then he starts worrying about an impending Cretan invasion. As soon as he has expressed himself, his fears are answered by the joyous news from the shore that the enemy ships have all sunk at sea. Again, not a detail that we find in Herodotus, more on which later. Here, at the midway point of the poem after these three groups of stanzas, Schiller begins recapitulating Herodotus' account. But instead of the simple letter that the Herodotean Amasis sends to Polykrates, here, Schiller's Amasis tells a highly personal story about a lost son. Auch mir ist alles wohlgeraten bei allen meinen Herrschertaten, begleitet mich des Himmels Huld. Doch hatte ich einen teuren Erben, den nahm mir Gott, ich sah ihn sterben, dem Glück bezahlt ich meine Schuld. Drum willst du dich vor Leid bewahren, so flehe zu den Unsichtbaren, dass sie zum Glück den Schmerz verleihen. Noch keinen sah ich fröhlich enden, auf den mit immer vollen Händen die Götter ihre Gaben streuen. Und wenn's die Götter nicht gewähren, so acht auf eines Freundes Lehren und rufe selbst das Unglück her. Und was von allen deinen Schätzen dein Herz am höchsten mag ergetzen, das nimm und wirf's in dieses Meer. In keeping with the compressed pace of the poem, Polykrates neither takes time to consider Amasis' advice, nor does he bother to sail out to sea to sacrifice his ring as he does in Herodotus, but simply throws it away from the roof of his palace. Now, in the final three stanzas of the poem, we are all but ready for a roller coaster of affects that range from happy and astonished to distraught and horrified. Und bei des nächsten Morgens Lichte, da tritt mit fröhlichem Gesichte ein Fischer vor den Fürsten hin. Herr, diesen Fisch hab ich gefangen, wie keiner noch ins Netz gegangen, dir zum Geschenke bring ich ihn. Und als der Koch den Fisch zerteilet, kommt er bestürzt herbeigeeilet und ruft mit hocherstauntem Blick, sieh, Herr, den Ring, den du getragen, ihn fand ich in des Fisches Magen, o, ohne Grenzen ist dein Glück. Hier wendet sich der Gast mit Grausen. So kann ich hier nicht ferner hausen. Mein Freund, kannst du nicht weiter sein. Die Götter wollen dein Verderben. Forteil ich, nicht mit dir zu sterben. Und sprach's und schiffte schnell sich ein. So to recap, the final part of Schiller's poem contains two more cycles of warning and response. First, the advice to throw away whatever he most treasures, after which the ring returns in the fish. Then his general warning that the gods want Polykrates destroyed, followed by Amasis' departure. Looking just at group 4 for a moment, it is interesting that Schiller breaks his pattern of affect, warning, and event here. For it would not be hard to imagine a narrative that would have been more faithful to Herodotus' version of the story, say, in which Polykrates is then assassinated by his enemies. But this is precisely not what happens. The more distant event is elided in favor of the more proximate event of their broken friendship. In a letter to Schiller on June 26, 1797, Goethe writes approvingly of the poem's ending. Der königliche Freund, vor dessen wie vor des Zuhörers Augen alles geschieht, und der Schluss, der die Erfüllung in suspenso lässt, alles ist sehr gut. In the third part of my talk, we will return to the question of what this lack of an ending might mean for the ballad as a whole. But for now, let us turn to the question of the ballad's oceanic imagery. For a poem so evidently concerned with the ocean's preternatural powers, it is curious that those powers are never themselves dramatized in the poem. Absent is the towering storm of Hero und Leander. Absent also are the overpowering currents of Die Bürgschaft and the clamoring sea monsters of Der Taucher. Yet not a stanza goes by in Der Ring des Polykrates without some reference to an ocean-born event. This is a poem whose plot is relentlessly driven by the ocean, and also a poem that systematically represses it from our view. The sea's present absence has led its commentators to come to rather different conclusions about its function and meaning in the poem. Ludwig Voigt calls the ocean a neutral space that helps the two kings find middle ground. Neumann calls it an anarchic force that obliterates politics altogether. Christopher Hutchinson reads Polykrates' gesture as a failure of economic policy. By sending his wealth off into nature rather than circulating it within society, he fails to be a good ruler. Michael Niehaus, on the other hand, sees the gesture in terms of betting and probability, in which the ocean might be read as a godly casino of fortune and doom. Against the backdrop of these views, I want to suggest that Schiller offers in his figuration of maritime loss and return what I will call a tragic poetics of retrieval. In Herodotus, only one object returns from the sea, but in Schiller's poem, someone or something returns in almost every stanza. The messenger from Miletus, the severed head, the treasure-laden ships, the navy returning from Crete, then and only then, the fateful ring. Let us look at a few of these examples in turn. In the 1798 Musenalmanach version of this poem, Schiller makes Polykrates' principal enemy the Spartans. Instead of der Kreter Waffenkun Gescharen, it was der Sparta nie besiegte Scharen that threatens Polykrates and the Samians. Although Herodotus does report a war between Samos and Sparta, Schiller likely realized that the Spartans were better known for their armies than for their navies, and so he replaced them later in his poem with the seafaring peoples of Crete. But there is also a mythological significance to Schiller's revision. Minos of Crete, a son of Zeus, and known mostly in connection with Daedalus and his half-son, the Minotaur, was acknowledged by Thucydides as the first ancient ruler to build a navy. For Herodotus, it is Polykrates who takes the credit for being the first verifiable historical figure to conquer the seas. In his pillaging of his neighbors' lands, he starts out as little more than a pirate. But by the end of his life, Herodotus goes so far as to call him a magnificent founder and the very first of the Greeks to establish a naval empire. Thus, in staging a conflict between Polykrates' claim to firstness and that of the divine Minos, Schiller is subtly signaling with the destruction of the Cretan forces a victory of a human over a god. And importantly, what is being reported here is not an earned victory, but a chance happening delivered by the ocean. Although Christian Garve notes that in the ancient Greek context, Sieg über die Feinde war das größte Glück. The Glück that we are talking about here is not the happiness of effortful achievement, but rather the fortune of contingency. Let us now consider another of Schiller's inventions, the figure of Polydorus. Getroffen sank dein Feind vom Speere, mich sendet mit der frohen Meere dein treuer Feldherr Polydor. Polydorus was a common enough name in ancient Greece. In mythology, it could refer to a number of heroes, including the blinded son of Cleopatra, a Ceteian warrior at Troy, and one of Penelope's suitors. A certain Polydorus is mentioned by Herodotus in passing as the grandfather of Laius, king of Thebes, and therefore part of a tragic lineage that stretches down to Oedipus. But Polydorus appears nowhere else in the histories. Schiller might have invented the name simply to give his poem a veneer of historical specificity. But if he had needed any name of 3 syllables, he could just as easily have used Theodor, which appears in the Degen translation in the exact passage that Schiller was adapting. So there must have been a deeper rationale behind his choice of Polydor. Perhaps he chose it because Polydorus means many gifts, and so it might be intended as a match for the name Polykrates, which means many powers. This would have created a certain symmetry between the many-powered ruler and his many-gifted captain on the field. But more importantly, Polydorus is also the murdered son of the queen of Troy, and the name therefore suggests a link to Euripides' tragedy Hecuba. On Euripides' account, Polydorus had been sent during the Trojan War to live under the protection of Polymastor, ruler of Thrace and longtime ally of the Trojan royal family. But when Polymastor learns that Troy has fallen, he murders Polydorus, throws his body into the sea, and keeps the treasure that he had been safekeeping on behalf of the Trojans. About halfway through the tragedy, Polydorus' corpse washes up improbably on the Trojan shore, thereby alerting Hecuba of her son's death and setting into motion the play's main vengeance plot. Let me name just a few of the thematic affinities that connect Schiller's Polydor to Euripides' Polydorus: the fatal desire for wealth and the circulation of precious objects, the issue of guest friendship and the ethical ties that bind political rulers, the trouble with sons and hereditary power. Both stories thematize the ocean as a repository of contingent events, capable, among other things, of returning lost objects against all odds. Euripides' tragedy is saturated with intimations of the ocean's mediating power. In one choral ode, the Trojan women curse the sea breeze that will carry them on ships to slavery. Here is a translation by Johann Jakob Steinbrüchel that Schiller would have read. Luft des Meeres, Luft, die du die schnellen Ozean wandelnden Schiffe über die Woge der See trägst. Wohin wirst du mich ärmste führen? Unter wessen Herrschaft und in wessen Hause werd ich als Sklavin kommen? Zum dorischen Gestalt? Oder an das Ufer vom Tier, wo sie sagen, dass der Vater der schönsten Gewässer Apidanus die Felder dunge. Against this backdrop, Schiller seems to be imbuing a Herodotean tale with a Euripidean pattern of tragic departures and returns. Herodotus emphasizes Polykrates' ruthless pillaging of his neighbors' lands, even those of his declared allies, just as Euripides emphasizes Polymestor's heartless decision to kill Polydorus in exchange for money. And as the classicist J.E. van der Veen argues, Polykrates' conflation of a material object with his most prized possession is a culpable one that fatally undercuts his attempt to placate the gods. What we might even call this Polykrates' ontological conflation of material objects with people. In Herodotus' version of the story, Amasis does not tell Polykrates what to throw away, only that he should choose was dir vorzüglich lieb sein. Schiller honors this openness in Amasis' request, and even suggests that what Amasis has in mind is on the order of a beloved son, like the one that Amasis himself lost. There is no historical basis for this report, in fact, quite the opposite. Herodotus writes that Amasis died a peaceful death after incurring the enmity of the Persians, leaving it to his young and inexperienced son to deal with their invasion. That son died miserably by suicide. So in reversing the timing of the father and son's deaths, Schiller implies that the sacrifice demanded of Polykrates would have been a significant one and not the ring. And whereas Herodotus furnishes details about the ring's consummate craftsmanship and its cultural significance as an heirloom of Samos, Schiller passes over these details in silence. With regard to the Herodotean account, we might even be authorized to complicate van der Veen's argument by reading the ring as a symbol of political power. Polykrates' gesture might have had an allegorical significance in which the ring's sacrifice signals Polykrates' willingness to relinquish some of his recently acquired power. In fact, as Herodotus himself reports, rings were the sign of kingly power for the Egyptians, whose mythology includes a succession conflict between the gods Setek and Horus, a conflict that is resolved by the fact that Horus possesses his father's ring. But in Schiller's account, there is no room for this kind of symbolic reading. The ring is neither Samian heirloom nor political signifier, but merely a Kleinod, a bauble unequal to the task that Polykrates assigns it when he declares, "Dieser Ring ist mein höchstes Gut." So far, we have considered how Schiller uses an apparent miscellany of historical inventions to alert us to the fact that the tragic mise-en-scene of this narrative has a Euripidean background. At the level of allusion, this takes the form of references to Hecuba and to classical mythology. At the level of characterization, it involves moments of hubris in Polykrates. And at the level of form, this helps populate Schiller's triple plot progression with anticipations of the ring's return. But what about the poem's powerful affective dimension? Here also, the ocean plays a crucial role. As I noted earlier, many of Schiller's ballads rehearse a characteristically Sturm und Drang conflict between man and sublime nature, in which the ocean's powerful forces both reach great heights and contain unsounded depths. In Der Taucher, the ocean's spray is so turbulent that it seems to touch the sky. Bis zum Himmel spritzet der dampfende Gischt, und Flut auf Flut sich ohne Ende drängt, und will sich nimmer erschöpfen und leeren, als wollte das Meer noch ein Meer gebären. And at the same time, the protagonist reaches depths so deep that he seems to arrive at the very edge of hell. Und schwarz aus dem weißen Schaum klafft hinunter ein gähnender Spalt, grundlos, als ging's in den Höhlenraum. In Hero und Leander, the Hellespont is likewise characterized as an abyssal body of water. Grauenvoll ist deine Tiefe. Die süße Frucht der Liebe hing am Abgrund der Gefahr. The storm that envelops Leander is described as a yawning void. Gähnend wie ein Höhlenrachen öffnet sich des Meeres Grund. We might even think of Goethe's 1781 poem, Grenzen der Menschheit, which recapitulates Schiller's concern with divine envy. Denn mit Göttern soll sich nicht messen irgendein Mensch. Importantly, Goethe's poem employs the figural projections of land, sky, and water, and suggests that human existence is most accurately characterized by the last. Humans are subject to the ups and downs of an inconstant fate. Uns hebt die Welle, verschlingt die Welle, und wir versinken. In Schiller's Polykrates, the top of the ocean's uncertain waves is invoked by Amasis as a warning against Polykrates' victory at Miletus. Bedenk auf ungetreuen Wellen, wie leicht kann sie der Sturm zerschellen, schwimmt deiner Flotte zweifelnd Glück. When his doubts have proved unfounded, Amasis worries about the Cretan invasion, but again that turns out that their ships have sunk at sea. Die Krete hat der Sturm zerstreut. But these are distant, Apollonian, second-hand images that depart significantly from the vivid descriptions of oceanic force in Der Taucher, for example. I want to suggest that the ocean's stormy capacity to encompass extreme heights and depths is here displaced onto the affects of its characters, which move unstably between extreme terror and extreme joy. Schiller's ballad one-sidedly emphasizes the motif of height at the expense of depth. The poem's spatial topography places Polykrates at the very highest place on the island, from which there is physically nowhere to go but down. Stand auf seines Daches Zinnen, schaute mit vergnügten Sinnen auf das beherrschte Samos hin. Amasis echoes the sense of dominion in his acknowledgement of Polykrates' successes. Die vormals deinesgleichen waren, sie zwingt jetzt deines Zepters Macht. And in perfect unity of place, the entirety of the narrative occurs from this vantage point high above the city. The kings themselves remain stationary until the very last line of the poem. The emphasis on height thereby sets the stage for Schiller's reading of Polykrates as a character who has transgressed the bounds of human limitation. It is as if the commanding position of the characters is a kind of recoil from the waters beneath them. The word hoch is even explicitly invoked when Amasis urges Polykrates to throw away whatever brings greatest delight to his heart. Was von allen deinen Schätzen dein Herz am höchsten mag ergetzen, to which Polykrates responds that his ring is his highest good. Von allem, was die Insel heget, ist dieser Ring mein höchstes Gut. And as if Amasis' astonishment at the news of the Samian army's safe return were not strong enough in emotion, der königliche Gast erstaunet. The cook's astonishment at the return of the ring is described with the neologism highest astonishment. Ruft mit hocherstauntem Blick. As Martin Dick notes, so tastet der Dichter zur Tiefe vor. Aber zur Kommunikation mit ihr kommt es noch nicht. Die hohen Kleinode kehren aus der Tiefe zurück. Sie werden nicht eingelöst. Noch wagt es der Dichter nicht, den Sturz in die Tiefe zu verbildlichen, die grausige Tiefe zu besichtigen. The poem's affective intensity belies the fact, however, that the feelings of shock, horror, and jubilation are all superficial feelings, insofar as they preclude reflection. In the context of Goethe's Faust, the twin emotions of Jammer and Graus signal a radical departure from bourgeois Enlightenment conceptions of tragic mitleid towards something less reflective, more primordial. As David Welbery notes, quote, Graus ist ein im deutschsprachigen Trauerspiel konventionell verwendeter Begriff für das schauderhaft Überwältigende, das durch die am Ende der Dramenhandlung eintretende Katastrophe ausgelöst wird. Whereas mitleid suggests a communicative, intersubjective dimension proper to bourgeois sociality, Jammer and Graus suggest pure sensation, so violent and all-encompassing that it is often used together with the verb fassen, as in Faust's line, Der Menschheit ganzer Jammer fasst mich an. In the grip of horror, there is no room for reflection. We might say the same of the feeling of Staunen. As René Descartes notes, astonishment, or étonnement, is a close cousin of wonder, admiration. But whereas wonder is useful for the sciences because it encourages investigation and learning, astonishment stupefies the mind. The whole body remains motionless as a statue, and we can perceive nothing of the object but the aspect of it first presented to us, so that we can gain no more detailed knowledge of it. This is what is commonly called being astonished, and astonishment is an excess of wonderment that can only ever be bad. Might we then draw a connection between the ungetreuen Wellen of the poem and its representation of intense but unreflective emotions? Certainly, the structure of the ballad would support such reading, for what better descriptor of the poem's alternating circles of joy, doubt, horror, and joy again is there than that of the wave? At the peak of each wave, Schiller engineers a miniature recognition scene, the severed head, the returning ships, the discovery of the fish, the recovery of the ring. And in the ballad's final stanza, Schiller inserts a miniature reversal of fate when Amasis turns to leave. Hier wendet sich der Gast mit Grausen. So far, we have seen the ways in which Schiller populates his poem with tragic allusions, forms, and affects. But Anagnorisis, peripeteia, pity, and fear do not a tragedy make, nor even does the hubris of a character who stands above the rest. For tragedies, foreground actions and their unexpected outcomes. Here, it is the ocean that soundlessly and mysteriously accomplishes Polykrates' desires on his behalf. Not only is Polykrates' tragic downfall completely omitted from the poem, but also are all aspects of deliberation leading up to the one action that Polykrates does take in the poem. In Herodotus' account, Polykrates actually takes the time to weigh Amasis' advice, literally taking it into his head, nao labon, and only after he decides that it was sound advice does he take action. Herodotus' Polykrates sails out into the deep sea and makes a whole ceremony out of his offering. Schiller, on the other hand, minimizes this event into a single line, und wirft das Kleinod in die Flut. The brevity of the line seems to suggest that Polykrates does so unreflectively, von Furcht beweget. Nowhere is Schiller's subversion of tragic causality more marked than in his frequent paratactic use of the conjunction und. The prominence of this conjunction is reflected at the global level in what Hartmut Laufhütte calls the Tendenz zur Aneinanderreihung knapper, deutlich begrenzter antithetische Strukturen ermöglichender Blöcke that makes up what he calls the fatale Glücksautomatismus of the poem. What he means by this is that there is neither time for deliberation nor for a working out of causes and effects. Affects arise in pure, unmixed form, and they grip the poem's characters with unmitigated force, to the point that it is hard to say that any of the figures are acting in the sense of Handlung, of making choices. They are reactive characters, driven by stimuli, subject to circumstance. Thus, Laufhütte notes die szenisch-situative Charakter des Gedichts, which, despite its condensation of striking and miraculous events, seems to function more like an elaborate mise en scène than as a full tragic plot with beginning, middle, and end. As much as Schiller's poem stages elements of tragedy, then, it is also playing at tragic conventions. In its extraordinary compression of motifs and tropes, the poem resembles an exuberant passage from Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, in which Werther writes, Ocean hat in meinem Herzen den Homer verdrängt. Welch eine Welt, in die der Herrliche mich führt. Zu wandern über die Heide, umsaust vom Sturmwinde, der in dampfenden Nebeln die Geister der Väter im dämmernden Lichte des Mondes hinführt. Zu hören vom Gebirge her, im Gebrülle des Waldstroms, halb verwehtes Ächzen der Geister aus ihren Hülen und die Wehklagen des zu Tode sich jammernden Mädchens die 4 moosbedeckten, grasbewachsenen Steine des Edelgefallenen ihres Geliebten. Although the scholarly literature remains divided over the question of whether Werther's enthusiasm mirrors Goethe's own for Ocean, or whether Goethe has written this passage with a tinge of irony, the text displays a marvelous degree of imagistic density that, as Adrian Daub points out, exists on the very razor's edge between sublimity and cliché. In many respects, Schiller's revision of Herodotus' source material, then, is a transformation of historical writing into a tragic drama that balances between pathos and cynicism. This transformation is doubly striking when we consider the ballad theory of ancient historiography, for the notion that Herodotus himself may have been reworking material from popular balladic poetry was most enthusiastically promoted by Barthold Georg Niebuhr in his 1847 lectures on German history. But the idea that the first historical prose was drawn from folk ballads was also endorsed as early as Tacitus, as well as by Vico and the early modern Dutch historian Perizonius. I am unsure whether Schiller had influenced Niebuhr, but the latter would certainly have been delighted at a poetry project that sought to return Herodotus' historical prose back into balladic form. In his Abhandlungen und Noten zum besseren Verständnis des westöstlichen Divans, Goethe writes that ballads share a special kinship with Greek tragedy because they are both forms that exhibit undifferentiated traces of tragic, epic, and drama. If ballads were eclectic at their very inception, then the modern form of the Kunstballade not only recapitulates this eclecticism, but also opens up these forms to play and parody. Susan Stewart writes of an antiquarianism modeled on acid-washed jeans. There is a distressed quality to the Kunstballade. And Osterkamp similarly argues that Schiller's late poetry is a thoroughly modern undertaking. Entscheidend ist, dass sich seine lyrische Antike nur durch das Kostüm, nicht aber in der Substanz von seiner Moderne mehr unterscheidet. So like many of the Kunstballaden that Schiller and Goethe wrote in 1797, Der Ring des Polykrates unites a number of traits that make the ballad a genre of eclecticism. There is something delightfully fable-like on the one hand about the return of the ring in the belly of a fish, which Wendy Doniger places alongside a Venetian myth as a kind of originary motif. She writes, fish are the ultimate lost and found of the folklore world. But there is also something preternatural about the ocean's inscrutable powers that evokes the fatefulness of Greek tragedy. Here, the sea functions as a latent repository and an emblem of utter contingency, a playing field on which fateful events are orchestrated beyond the purview of human will. And finally, there is something condensed, perhaps even humorously so, about the ocean's instantaneous return of lost objects. As a field of circulation in which Polykrates' ring comes to signify both present fortune and future misfortune, we are given a view of the tyrant's life contained within a single lyrical moment. In the 19th and 20th century musical reception of German ballads, composers like Alma Mahler, Karl Weigel, Jean Sibelius, and Hans Pfitzner converted a variety of ballads into Lieder. Yet it is a curious fact about this movement that almost none of the ballads they chose were about the sea. As Adrian Daub notes, there might have been something about the heavy, fateful, peripatetic themes of these maritime ballads that made them less suited for private music and more suited for public anthems and nationalist projects. Especially interesting in this context is the fact that Schiller's ballad had to be rewritten for a domestic setting before it was used by Erich Wolfgang Korngold, then only 17 years old, for his operatic debut. With the help of librettist Leo Feld, Korngold used a play from 1888 by the Austrian dramatist Heinrich Teveles as the basis for his one-act comedy. In this light-hearted parody, Amasis and Polykrates are reimagined as jealous friends, The ring becomes a symbol of marital happiness, and the ocean's tragic powers are relocated to a mundane household setting. The drama takes place in 1797 in Saxony, where the music director Wilhelm Arndt and his new wife Laura are celebrating Wilhelm's promotion at court. Everything seems perfect, Wilhelm sings, except for the absence of his long-lost friend Peter Vogel. But when Peter unexpectedly arrives that same day, things actually take a turn for the worse. For it turns out that Peter was once in love with Laura. So he jealously convinces Wilhelm that he should ask his wife the Schicksalsfrage. Hast du vor mir geliebt? As proof of his sincerity and the soundness of his advice, Peter shows Wilhelm a copy of Schiller's poem and convinces him that what he has to throw away is the ring by picking a fight with his wife. Werf ich den Ring becomes a recurring refrain in Wilhelm's mind until he finally asks Laura the Schicksalsfrage. Naturally, his wife is incensed, and it takes a whole act full of comic misunderstandings and gorgeous polyphonic singing for the pair to recognize that the ring they must sacrifice is not their own happiness, but the presence of their jealous friend Peter. Eines Kleinods mich zu entschlagen, sings Wilhelm, muss dir dem Freunde ich entsagen. So when Peter happens to find a ring in the garden and brings it back inside, the couple laughingly call him a fish and push him out the door, never to receive him again. The Polykrates figure in this play is thus innocent of hubris, whereas the Amasis figure is an envious, clumsy, and sympathetic villain. Schiller's motif of divine envy is now displaced onto the jealousy of Peter himself, who transposes Amasis' fear of unfaithful waves, ungetreuen Wellen, into his own fear of unfaithful women. Peter claims to be in the grip of Schiller's poem. He even brings a copy of the Musenalmanach fresh from Weimar, soeben ediert. But his obvious investment in the situation and his feelings for Laura make it hard for us not to believe that he is merely instrumentalizing Schiller's ballad for his own purposes. We might go so far as to say that his repeated fear of divine envy is a form of veiled self-disclosure. What he unwittingly warns his friends against is the destructive power of his own feelings. The lesson that the characters learn from Schiller's ballad is not the one that Amasis gives to Polykrates, nor even the one that Peter himself draws from the poem, but rather the following. Lass vom Glück dich träumen führen, sollst ans Glück nicht zweifeln rühren. This is a moral that sounds like it might belong to the end of a fable, but it is also a thoroughly modern one that no longer has any room for preternatural events or for tragic intimations from the ocean. To take a line from W.H. Auden's 1949 lectures on Romanticism and the Sea, Korngold's opera stages a world in which bourgeois society has finally made wild nature into a domestic affair. The sea, after all, is that state of barbaric vagueness and disorder out of which civilization has emerged and into which, unless saved by the effort of gods and men, it is always liable to relapse. It is so little of a friendly symbol that the first thing which the author of the Book of Revelation notices in his vision of the new heaven and earth at the end of time is that there was no more sea. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for that elegant and beautifully paced paper. We've learned so much about the poem through your careful consideration of Schiller's sources, your skillful, close reading, and your altogether inspiring analysis of oceanic imagery, especially in its relation to. It's been a great privilege.
It's been an honor to be here.
Oh, well, it's been a real privilege at the EGS, the English Goethe Society, to have you as this year's Prawer lecturer. And I feel sure we'll be reading more of your scholarship for too long.
Yes, I very much look forward to that process. Thank you again, Charlotte.
Thank you.